purpose of this series is to provide an overview of select vintage and modern games, their pros and their cons, and what are the essential books and items that you need to play them. With different editions, multiple games appearing and to be similar on the surface, and a huge variety of supplements and expansions, newcomers and even some veterans can often find it a daunting and confusing place to be, and this series hopes to lend a helping hand. Continuing the short side trek covering certain pop culture franchises that have made their way into role-playing games, in this episode we will be covering the handful of games set in the Star Wars universe. Why cover multiple games in one review such as this? Well, a lot of the time, games built on franchises do not have much in the way of longevity. Demands from the licensor, a shift from one licensee to another, and all of the copyright and intellectual property involved means that once something happens, the game is no more. At least from a publication perspective. Building a game from a licensed property is almost like building castles on sand. So while games such as Dungeons & Dragons and Traveller have long and varied histories, most licensed games do not. Although quite often the properties themselves, as we shall see with Star Wars, end up having a long history within role-playing. The idea of Star Wars being good fodder for role-playing games goes way back, pretty much to the point of the movie, then just named Star Wars with no episode number or subtitle, first hit screens. In fact, I was exposed to Star Wars before I even knew that role-playing games existed, even though I was very much invested on the basic concept of it by putting my action figures through their own adventures. The first time, to my recollection, that we see Star Wars in published role-playing game form is with Traveller's Supplement 4, Citizens of the Imperium, in 1979. Within the Heroes and Villains chapter here, we find stats for both Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, among others, from a variety of different science fiction settings. This is used here to exemplify the broad scope of setting that the Traveller rules are capable of. But within the context of our history, we can see that the relationship between Star Wars and role-playing games was a relatively early thing. For Star Wars to get its own dedicated role-playing game, it took a while longer. So enter West End Games. West End Games originally formed in 1974, named after a West End bar near Columbia University, in which the founding of the company was settled. They began, like many of the companies that would end up producing role-playing games, as a board and board war game producer, but really gained traction in 1984 with the release of the role-playing game Paranoia. With their entry into the role-playing market and the production capabilities that they had built up over the preceding years, West End were fair competitors to the giant that TSR had become. This footing allowed them to go after fairly major licenses, something that only a handful of companies were capable of. Their first licensed role-playing game was Ghostbusters, released in 1986. Their second, and perhaps most famous, came next year, with 1987's Star Wars, written by Greg Costikyan. As mentioned before, West End were known for their quality, and this extended into the quality of their writing as well as their production values. They released a lot of supplements for their Star Wars game, including volumes that tied into the events of the movies and the novels, ones that detailed parts of the Star Wars galaxy that we had yet to see on screen or in fiction, and detailed splat books covering planets and creatures and character types. Such was the quality of the writing that much of their game material was used by authors as reference. Lucasfilm even forwarded West End books to Timothy Zahn as reference materials for his work on the Thrawn trilogy. A lot of reference to West End's work remains in Star Wars canon today. Mace Windu, for example, is a name created by Martin Whitstead for a West End game product, although here he is a squib businessman operating within Mos Eisley on Tatooine rather than a Jedi Master. A second edition in 1992, written by Bill Smith, cleaned up many of the rules and incorporated, as is usual for second editions, lessons learned and enhancements made over the 5 years since the first edition. The editions are different enough to require some level of conversion, but this is not heinous. A revised and expanded version of the second edition came out in 1996. West End kept up the quality of its output for the game through all 3 editions. Unfortunately, West End fell victim to the mid to late 1990s implosion of the role-playing game industry, but for entirely different reasons than those which claimed TSR, Games Designers Workshop, Iron Crown Enterprises and others. West End had a parent company, in the form of the Butchie Retail Group, which its founder, Scott Palter, had tapped for finances to initially create the company in 1974 and to acquire the Star Wars license in 1987. When financial mismanagement led Butchie to file for bankruptcy in 1998, they effectively took West End with them. Palter did try to save the game company by filing for Chapter 11, but this came to nothing. Lucasfilm pulled the Star Wars license from them, and the designers of Paranoia sued for ownership of that game. West End Games was acquired in 2001 by Humanoids Inc., and again in 2003 by Purgatory Publishing, and again in 2016 by Nocturnal Media. But essentially, the events of 1998 killed the company. A version of West End Star Wars rules was released as the generic science fiction D6 space game in 2004. And Scott Palter passed away in February of 2020. Now enter Wizards of the Coast. Wizards had purchased TSR by the time that West End Games was going under, and had begun to formulate plans for the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons. One of the directions they were heading with the game was to engineer a core system, titled the D20 system, as a generic platform on which different role-playing games could be constructed. A number of companies, West End Games included, had found some success along these lines in the past, so it was a logical step for Wizards to take. Wizards purchased the Star Wars license from Lucasfilm, seeing the opportunity to bring a big franchise name into the D20 fold alongside Dungeons & Dragons itself. So shortly after the release of 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons in 2000, the D20 Star Wars role-playing game came into print. The game itself was written by Andy Collins, who had previous science fiction game design experience with the Alternity game, J.D. Weicker, who had contributed design work for the 3rd edition D&D core books, and Bill Slavicsek, who had been the editor and developer of West End Games and their Star Wars role-playing game. Even after leaving West End Games for TSR in 1990, he was still kept in touch, contributing to the 2nd edition of West End's game and a number of supplements. Bill is also a Star Wars aficionado, having written the 2nd and 3rd editions of the Guide to the Star Wars Universe in 1994 and 2000 respectively. He also put design work into the Alternity game. The Wizards version of Star Wars role-playing possessed all of those elements that you expect from a D20 game: classes, races, skills, feats, and virtual compatibility with Dungeons & Dragons. It was a solid game, and the D20 mechanics and class level progress suited the heroic nature of Star Wars. Several quality supplements were released, although by no means the volume that West End published. A revised edition was released in 2002, which was more or less an effort in rebalancing classes and feats, as well as incorporating material from Episode 2, The Attack of the Clones, the initial D20 edition having been released shortly after Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Some of the revisions made would fold back into Dungeons & Dragons with the 3.5 edition of that game. Supplements for the revised edition were far fewer and spread out over just 2 years, from May 2002 through to July 2004. It seemed that interest in the license was waning, perhaps understandably, given the rise in popularity of Dungeons & Dragons from 2000 and the need to support that game. The comparison between Dungeons & Dragons and Star Wars material released by Wizards between 2000 and 2004 is very telling. Within a couple of follow years, Wizards came out with a new Star Wars game, the Saga Edition. This was not built on the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which was released a year later, but rather was virtually a new game in its own right. While based on the D20 system, the Saga Edition was very much streamlined, with unique elements replacing certain systems. For example, a change from D20 skills to Saga Edition trained skill picks, with broader skill definitions. For those of us of a certain age, the naming of this edition was somewhat unfortunate, as it was sometimes confused with the combination of role-playing and card game that the Saga system that Wizards had released several years earlier, using it to drive Dragonlance and the Marvel Superheroes game. During the Wizards of the Coast era, much more emphasis was placed on the use of miniatures. While West End had certainly produced miniatures rules and had worked with Grenadier models to produce a line of metal figures to support them, that was nothing like the explosion of miniatures that Wizards produced. Both Star Wars and Dungeons & Dragons skirmish miniature games were published using simplified D20 rules to drive them. The Saga Edition placed even more emphasis on the miniatures, and thousands of plastic stormtroopers made their way into the galaxy. And to be frank, a lot of us played the Star Wars miniatures game a heck of a lot more than the D20 role-playing game offerings. Perhaps that's what was driving the system's development. In any case, the Saga Edition was supported in much the same way as the revised edition had been, and in 2010 Wizards of the Coast announced that they would not be renewing their license to produce games based on the Star Wars property. The license was picked up in 2011 by Fantasy Flight Games. Initially, they produced the excellent X-Wing miniatures game, which has a history all of its own, and a Star Wars card game. It wasn't until late 2012 when the first offering of a role-playing game arrived, in the beta edition of the first in a trilogy of related and mechanically identical games. The full version of this game, Star Wars Edge of the Empire, was released in 2013. In a strange move, Fantasy Flight released the beta version as a product, offering no money-back incentive for the full version on release. This drew some criticism, but the choice was there for people to make. I assume Fantasy Flight used the beta to part fund the development, but I am glad, with a few notable exceptions, that the practice hasn't gained a lot of traction in the role-playing game market. Later, in September 2013, the beta for a second game in the series was released, Age of Rebellion, with its full version coming in July 2014. This pattern was followed by the third game, Force and Destiny, with its beta in September 2014 and full release in July 2015. All three games received beginner box sets prior to their main rulebook release, complete with basic rules, a scenario, a miniature scale map, dice and tokens. The dice are perhaps the major thing that makes this iteration of Star Wars role-playing stand out. Forays into using custom dice for role-playing have been made before, for example with the Fudge system and the Xena and Hercules role-playing game, both of which use six-sided dice with symbols rather than numbers. Fantasy Flight were also proponents of custom dice within their own game. X-Wing, for example, released a couple of years before its role-playing cousin, used symbol-laden 8-sided dice to determine combat outcomes. With the role-playing game, a full gamut of symbol-laden dice were called for, which drew more criticism. Despite all of this, the game was successful, and a number of high-quality supplements have been released sporadically over the years. In recent years, the game's release has been pared down to generic sourcebooks not tied to one of the three core books, describing Star Wars eras or compiling information on, for example, starships and characters. The core system was extracted into a generic role-playing game called Genesis in 2017. In 2020, it was announced that Fantasy Flight will be focusing more on its board games, with Edge Entertainment taking over responsibility for role-playing games, including Star Wars, and Atomic Mass taking over miniatures games, including the Star Wars games X-Wing and Armada. What this will entail has yet to be seen, with the latest books in the role-playing series, Starships and Speeders, having been released in February 2020 under the Fantasy Flight banner. To take our history almost full circle, Fantasy Flight released a 30th anniversary edition of West End Games' first edition Star Wars role-playing game in 2018. The license to produce role-playing games within the Star Wars universe remains with Fantasy Flight and its parent company, Asmodee, for the time being, although the wind appears to have gone out of its sails. What the future holds is anyone's guess. But with the Star Wars universe in absolute right place for role-playing adventures, it is unlikely that there will not be a game set within it for some time to come. The original West End Games edition of Star Wars captures the universe brilliantly in its source material. The game itself is simple. A character's skills have associated dice rolls, which he rolls against target numbers. For example, shooting a blaster at medium range by a competent shooter would require a roll of 5 six-sided dice against a target of 15. Modifiers usually add or subtract dice from the pool that you are rolling to achieve success. For example, firing twice in one round reduces each shot's pool by 1 dice. A moderately competent shooter would roll 4 dice per shot. Competitive skills are rolled and the results used as a difficulty or added to an existing difficulty. For example, evading an attack would require a dodge skill roll, which is then added to the difficulty number for the attack. This simplicity allows resolution of action not to get into the way of the narrative of action, which is an essential thing for a game attempting to portray the cinematic action of something like Star Wars. Damage recording is equally cinematic. If an attack hits, the character must make a strength roll against the damage roll made for the weapon. Depending on how well this rolls compare, the target may be stunned, essentially miss a turn, wounded, or skills are made using 1 6-sided die, incapacitated, down, can't act, or mortally wounded, dying. The mechanic here is a little bit cumbersome, but the resolution and the record keeping is very simple. One thing that is problematic, but not in any major way, is that the rules fall foul of one of the most common and necessary complications in role-playing games. That is, it possesses modifiers on both sides of the dice roll equation. The simple mechanic, roll a number of dice against a target number, can be modified according to the situation and action by both the number of dice being used and the target number being rolled against. So many games use this, and it is not needed. Pick one side of the equation, leave the other static. That way, players have a better chance of understanding how their actions are affecting their potential for success. If a target for their potential success is also changeable, things aren't so clear. Anyway, I digress. One of the major things any science fiction game should be judged on is, how do spacecraft slug it out? Over the years, there have been generally 2 answers to this: abstract it into a role-playing term, or explode it into a mini-game of its own. Almost by tradition, sci-fi games often have done both. With Traveller, there is Mayday, Brilliant Lances and Battle Rider as Starship Combat games that sit alongside the abstract rules from the role-playing game. With West End Star Wars, there is Star Warriors. The abstract version of the rules works very well. It does not suddenly drop players into systems they are not familiar with, as it uses the same methodology for skills, ship characteristics, weapons and damage, in a ship's case light, heavy, severe and destroyed, as does character combat. Again, within the cinematic scope of the setting, this abstraction just works. Porkins, you're too low. The second edition does things a little differently. Target numbers are provided as a range, giving more granularity, and equate damage ranges to difficulties rather than target numbers, although essentially the same thing with changed vernacular. Damage is still categorised, but you can outright kill a target in this edition without them passing through mortally wounded. Optional rules allow for body hit locations to be used. Starship Combat remains mostly the same, but again, a little more detail has been added. Movement of starships and vehicles is handled differently, with movement given in a more statistic and a kilometres per hour rating. Essentially, the second edition is the same game as the first, with more detail, more colour, and a few of the kinks knocked out. Given all of that, both the first and second editions are solid games with good appreciation for their cinematic nature of Star Wars action. The first edition is currently available as the 30th anniversary edition from Fantasy Flight, but my choice between the West End editions would be the revised second edition, purely for the additional content that it contains. And so, on to Wizards' D20 editions. Much as I like the D20 system, and I refer to my video on 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons for my full take on it, I don't think that it's a good fit for Star Wars as West End's rules. While the D20 system is simple, roll 20-sided dice, add modifiers, try beat target, the complexity comes from what orbits that mechanic. This includes skills, feats, classes and so on. The strategic and tactical options of all of these options is one of the strengths of the D20 system and the major factor in what makes it flexible, but they are a weakness when depicting high action. In combat, D20 is essentially about positioning and using abilities during a fight to maximise the modifiers that you get while minimising the modifiers your opponent gets. Even with the simplifications and Star Wars flavour brought to the D20 Star Wars game, All that crunching is still largely present. Both the original and the revised D20 Star Wars editions are good games, but they do not capture the Star Wars spirit as much as the West End editions. The Saga Edition is essentially a simplified cut of D20. It cuts the classes available down from 9 to 5. There's a song in that somewhere. The broad concept being, for instance, if you're a Jedi, you're a Jedi. So is there really much use to differentiate between the different types of Jedi when player options can be used to build those concepts from a simpler foundation? Such options were constructed as talent trees. So for our Jedi example, instead of separate Jedi Guardian and Jedi Consular classes, the Saga Edition has one Jedi class and the Guardian, Consular, Sentinel and Lightsaber Combat talent trees. Characters can freely choose between talent trees as long as they meet prerequisites. This creates greater character flexibility than by representing every nuance as a separate class. Skill points are done away with in Saga. Instead, characters select a number of trained skills from the list of class skills and must take a skill training feat to add more skills. No skill point purchases per level, no skill ranks, instead just gaining a bonus per level, and no cross-class skills. The number of skills available over the D20 edition is also reduced. This cuts more fat from the D20 system. Feats remain pretty much the same, with new feats being available every few levels and so on. Mechanically, the game is identical in its roll 1d20 plus mods versus target number base. Someone coming into the Saga Edition from the D20 edition will be in familiar territory here, with really only the simplifications made to the game from full fat D20 to get their head around. Saga does place more emphasis on miniatures, but this is more or less on par with the D20 version, even within vehicle and space combat. Now, the Fantasy Flight games are constructed around the narrative custom dice. Character generation is really easy, and the character statistics are very simple compared to previous Star Wars games. At base, you select a species, a career, and a specialisation within that career. According to how powerful the species is, the character receives a pool of experience points to spend on characteristics, skills, and talents. Talents use tree development based on the character's specialisation, and further specialisations can be purchased later in the game, as more experience points are earned. Beginning characters do not tend to be too different from each other, but the further into the game they get, the more diverse they will become. Role-playing aspects are baked into the game, by which I mean background and so on mean something mechanically. One thing that is really interesting is the way that the different games, Edge of the Empire, Age of Rebellion and Force and Destiny, have different focuses reflecting their scope. For Edge of the Empire, it's obligation, reflecting, for example, Han Solo's debt to Jabba the Hutt that drove his character's background to a certain extent through Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. For Age of Rebellion, it's duty, reflecting the commitment to the cause and the shape that takes. And finally, for Force and Destiny, it's morality, that never-ending struggle to avoid the temptations of the dark side. As mentioned before, it is the narrative dice that really make Fantasy Flight's game. Each of the dice used are colour-coded for ease of reference, with both colour code and dice size being used within the rules. A green diamond in this section of rules, for example, refers to the green 8-sided ability dice. Players build up a pool of dice based on the character's capabilities. Characteristics and skills contribute ability and proficiency dice. The referee contributes difficulty and challenge dice, and both contribute boost and setback dice depending on the situation. Boost and setback dice are added to reflect favourable or unfavourable conditions, or a combination. The entire pool is rolled, and the resulting symbols appearing are totted up. Certain symbols negate other symbols, and some symbols provide special effects, some of which can be carried over. The final symbol totals provide the referee a guideline to describe what happens as a result of the task that the character was attempting. This is a combination of hard rules, these symbols mean exactly this, and also interpretation. The unique factor here is that unlike most games where actions are performed on a success or failure line, the possible interpretations for Fantasy Flight's mechanic can include success alongside bad things happening, failure alongside good things happening, and all points in between. This interpretive style of play is slow at first, but once you get used to it, then the mechanic paints a dynamic and exciting scenes. Combat is abstract, with the players and the referee left to interpret where combatants are in relation to each other. Miniatures can help, but the game is not written with these in mind. It is a similar case with respect to vehicle and space combat. For me, the unfortunate thing here is that Fantasy Flight have kept each of their Star Wars games compartmentalised, where some form of integration would have been great to see. The X-Wing and Armada games, for example, have no relationship to the role-playing game, so cannot easily be used with each other. Similarly, Legion is its own game, so cannot easily be used for a more miniatures-based variant of the role-playing game's personal combat system. In my opinion, this is a missed opportunity. A lot of adventures and supplements have been produced for all three of the core trilogy, with a number of additional volumes that are not tied to any of them specifically. Cards depicting talents for each of the careers have also been released, which make talent trees easier to reference during play. All in all, it's a beautifully crafted and fun game. So where to rank them all? For me, the initial D20 game from Wizards of the Coast does not particularly describe my expectations of the Star Wars universe in game form. As much as I like the D20 system and feel the books that Wizards release are well written, I don't think the system and setting are a good match. The Saga Edition does do a little better, but has essentially the same problem, albeit somewhat alleviated by the streamlining of the system. West End's game is great, and its supplements still hold up today. The mechanics work to provide a cinematic experience and so capture the essence of the Star Wars universe very well. If you don't like using non-standard dice or balk at the price tag that Fantasy Flight have on their books, I wholeheartedly recommend either version of this game. But if you are going for the second edition, pick up the revised and expanded book. My top pick is Fantasy Flight Star Wars offering. While I have some issues with the way it's organised, 3 core games that have a huge overlap, where one core rulebook with 3 supplemental volumes could have perhaps served better, the game itself captures the spirit of a cinematic narrative. The books, while expensive, have great depth and detail and are meticulously presented. It is an elegant game, mechanically and physically. And there you have it. My thoughts on one of my favourite franchises within one of my favourite forms of gaming. Perhaps more so than any other science fiction franchise, Star Wars lends itself to the role-playing game arena very well, with its wide array of species, planets, starships and character types. Indeed, the current crop of Star Wars TV shows almost feel as if someone took their personal Star Wars game campaign and slapped it onto the screen. Punch it, Chewie.